The day Theodora Turner rode into Garrett Valley, she carried three things that told the whole story of her ruin. A baby girl sleeping against her chest, a deed that had been burned down to half its paper, and an expression on her face that said she had already survived the worst and was simply waiting to see what came next. The spring of 1878 had arrived early in the Colorado Territory, and the mountains to the west still held their snow like men holding secrets they were not yet ready to give up. The valley itself was green and wide, cut through the middle by a clear creek that caught the morning light and threw it back at the sky. Cottonwood trees lined the water's edge, their new leaves small and pale and trembling in the April wind. It was the kind of land that made a person feel something had been promised to them, even if no one had ever said the words aloud. Theodora had been riding since before dawn, her old roan mare picking her way carefully along the rocky trail that descended from Barlow Pass. The baby, Clara, was 6 months old and had the remarkable gift of sleeping through nearly everything, a talent she had developed, Theodora suspected, as a natural response to a life that had already held more chaos than any infant ought to encounter. Clara was wrapped in a blue wool blanket that had once belonged to Theodora's mother, and her round face was tucked against Theodora's collarbone with an expression of absolute trust that made Theodora's chest ache every single time she looked down at it. She had left Pueblo 3 days ago with 40 cents, half a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, and the burned deed. The deed was to 240 acres in Garrett Valley, Colorado Territory, land that had belonged to her late husband, James Turner, before a fire had taken their farmhouse, their savings, and James himself in a single terrible February night. The fire had been no accident. Theodora knew this the way she knew the color of her own eyes. Warren Colby, the land agent in Pueblo, had wanted that land for 6 years, had made offers twice, had been refused twice, and then had found other means. But knowing a thing and being able to prove it were two entirely different creatures, and Theodora had learned that lesson with a harshness that left marks. The deed had survived the fire only because she had carried it in her coat pocket when she ran out of the burning house with Clara in her arms. But the edges had caught, and the bottom third of the document was gone, the ink that had once specified the northern boundary of the property now reduced to a brown curl of nothing. A burned deed, a lawyer in Pueblo had told her, his voice not unkind but his eyes already moving toward his next appointment, was a complicated thing. Without the full document, without the survey markers, without James Turner alive to testify, the land claim could be challenged by anyone with the right paperwork and enough money to pay the right clerk. Warren Colby had both. So Theodora had done what a woman in 1878 with 40 cents, a baby, a burned deed, and nowhere left to go could do. She had ridden toward the land itself. If she could get to the valley, if she could put her feet on that ground and find someone who had known James, who had known the boundaries, who had seen the original survey, then maybe she still had something to fight with. It was not much of a plan. She was aware of this, but it was the only one she had. The trail opened up at the bottom of the pass, and the valley spread before her with a sudden generosity that made her pull the roan to a stop and simply breathe for a moment. The land was exactly as James had described it. He had spoken of this valley with a warmth in his voice that she had only heard otherwise when he spoke of Clara. Rolling green fields, the creek running silver, the mountains standing guard on 3 sides like enormous patient sentinels. And there, perhaps a mile ahead, a ranch. It was a solid, serious ranch. The kind of place that had been built not for appearance but for endurance. The main house was 2 stories of squared timber and chinked log, with a wide porch running across the front and a stone chimney at each end. To its east sat a large barn, its red paint faded to a pleasant rust by years of mountain weather, and beside that a series of corrals where she could see horses moving. There were cattle in the south pasture, a substantial herd, and the whole enterprise had about it the quiet confidence of something that had been here a long time and intended to remain. Theodora urged the roan forward. She was aware of how she must look. 3 days of trail had left her dusty and wind-burned, her brown hair escaping its braid in every direction, her green dress stained at the hem with creek mud from a bad crossing the previous afternoon. Clara had spit up on her shoulder that morning, and there had been no opportunity to fully address the situation. She was 26 years old and she looked, she imagined, like exactly what she was, a woman at the end of her rope, making one last reach for something solid. She rode up to the fence that bordered the ranch yard and stopped there, because there was a man standing between her and the house, and he was watching her approach with an expression so carefully neutral it was almost alarming. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered. Tall with the kind of lean, steady build that came from years of actual work rather than the performance of it. He wore worn dark trousers, a canvas shirt the color of oak bark, and a hat that had been shaped by weather and time into something that suited him absolutely. His jaw was square and dark with a day's worth of beard, and his eyes, even at this distance, were a gray so clear and direct that Theodora had the disorienting sensation of being read like a letter. He did not call out to her. He simply watched her approach with those steady gray eyes, and when she reached the fence, he stepped forward and reached up without being asked to take hold of the roan's bridle, steadying the horse with a calm, sure hand. "Sir," Theodora said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, a small mercy. "I am looking for the Garrett ranch. I was told in town it was this valley." "You found it," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not waste itself on unnecessary words. "Then you are Edwin Garrett." "I am." She reached into her coat and drew out the burned deed, leaning down from the saddle to offer it to him. "My name is Theodora Turner. This was my husband's land. 240 acres in this valley, deeded to James Turner in 1873. James passed this February, and a man named Warren Colby is trying to claim the land as his own. I came here because I did not know where else to go, and because I believe you may have known my husband, or at least may know the boundaries of his claim." Edwin Garrett took the burned deed from her hand. He looked at it for a long moment, turning it carefully, reading what remained. Then he looked up at her, and his gaze moved briefly, very briefly, to Clara, who had chosen this moment to wake up and was now blinking at him with enormous brown eyes from the folds of the blue blanket. Something shifted in Edwin Garrett's face. It was subtle, the way a mountain looks the same from a distance, but is entirely different when you are close enough to see the detail of it. It was not pity. Pity was something Theodora had learned to recognize and resent. This was something else, something older and quieter. He handed the deed back to her and said very simply, "You are home now. Let me help you down." Those 4 words, stated with such complete and unadorned certainty, were so unexpected that Theodora simply stared at him for a moment. She had been braced for skepticism, for questions, for the careful measuring look that men gave to women traveling alone who showed up on their property with complicated claims and insufficient documentation. She had not been braced for that. "Mr. Garrett," she said carefully, "you do not know me." "I knew James Turner," he said. "I know this deed, or what remains of it, and I know Warren Colby." He said the last name with a flatness that contained an entire history of opinion. "Let me help you down, Mrs. Turner. You have been riding a long time." She let him help her down. His hands were careful and impersonal, steadying her as she swung Clara to one hip and dismounted, and he stepped back immediately once she was on the ground with the good manners of a man who understood the importance of personal space to a woman in uncertain circumstances. Up close, she could see that he was perhaps 30 years old, possibly 32. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into the sun rather than from age, and a scar along his left jaw that she would not ask about, at least not today. He smelled of horse and wood smoke and clean wool, and he looked at her with those gray eyes in a way that was absolutely direct and absolutely respectful at the same time, a combination she had not encountered recently. "How long have you been riding?" he asked. "3 days from Pueblo." He looked at the roan, who was showing honest signs of exhaustion, then back at Theodora. "Come inside," he said. "I will have my man see to your horse. You need water and a meal and somewhere to sit down. Mr. Garrett, I do not want to presume upon your hospitality. I came here with a specific purpose, and Mrs. Turner," he said, and there was that quiet finality again, not unkind, not commanding, simply certain. "You are carrying an infant, and you have been 3 days on the trail. There is nothing to discuss about coming inside. The rest can wait." Theodora looked at him for a moment. Clara grabbed a fistful of her coat collar and held on. "All right," Theodora said. "Thank you." The inside of the house surprised her. She had expected a bachelor's spare disorder, the neglect that accumulated when no one had reason to keep things neat. What she found instead was a house that was clean and considered, not decorated in any elaborate way, but arranged with a kind of quiet intention that spoke of a man who lived deliberately. The main room held a large stone fireplace, a table of solid pine, 4 chairs, and a bookshelf along one wall that held perhaps 40 volumes. The floor was swept. The windows were clean. A pot of something that smelled of venison and onions simmered on the cast-iron stove. A woman of perhaps 55 appeared from the kitchen corridor, broad and dark-haired, with a face that showed both competence and warmth in equal measure. "Mrs. Acosta," Edwin said, "this is Theodora Turner. She will be staying. She has a baby. Could you bring water and whatever is ready to eat?" Mrs. Acosta looked at Theodora, then at Clara, then at Edwin in that order, and her expression went through approximately 4 distinct emotions in about 2 seconds before settling on a warm and practical welcome. Sit down," she said, waving Theodora toward a chair by the fire. "I will bring everything. What does the little one need? Is she nursing?" "I can warm some milk if she has started on solid." "She nurses," Theodora said, and felt a blush rise in her face because she was tired and off balance, and it was strange to discuss such things with strangers. "Then you sit and eat and take care of her, Mrs. Acosta said firmly, as if this were the most reasonable arrangement in the world. "Mr. Garrett, you go tell Hector to see to the horse." Edwin went, without appearing to take any offense at being redirected by his housekeeper, and Theodora sank into the chair by the fire and held Clara and felt, for the first time in 3 days, the specific weight of exhaustion that comes when you have been holding yourself rigid with purpose and are suddenly allowed to let some of it go. She ate. Mrs. Acosta brought venison stew and fresh cornbread and strong coffee, and Theodora ate all of it with a thoroughness that might have embarrassed her under other circumstances. Clara nursed and then fell asleep again with her usual efficient dedication, and by the time Edwin returned from the corral, Theodora had recovered enough of herself to feel the full strangeness of her situation. She was sitting in a stranger's house in a strange valley, with a burned deed and a sleeping baby, and no plan beyond the desperate hope that this man had known her husband and could help her prove what she owned. Edwin settled into the chair across the fire from her, removed his hat and set it on the table. His dark hair was slightly pressed from the hat's band. He folded his hands and looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention. "Tell me what happened," he said. So she told him. She told him about the farmhouse fire in February, about waking at 2 in the morning to the smell of smoke and the sound of her husband shouting from downstairs, about grabbing Clara and running, about the fact that she reached the yard and turned and saw James still inside, trying to save what he could, about the moment she understood he was not coming out. She told this part plainly and quickly, because it was the part that, if she dwelled on it, would undo her, and she was not ready to be undone in front of this man she had known for less than an hour. She told him about Warren Colby's man appearing 3 days after the funeral, with paperwork that claimed the land had been deeded to Colby's Land Company under a debt settlement agreement that James had allegedly signed. She told Edwin that James had signed no such thing, that she had known their finances as well as James had, that there had been no such debt. She told him that the lawyer in Pueblo had reviewed Colby's papers and said they appeared to be in order, and had reviewed her burned deed and said it was unfortunately incomplete, and had suggested that without further documentation, the matter would likely need to go before a judge, and that judges in Colorado Territory in 1878 tended to look favorably upon organized paperwork over burned fragments. She did not cry during any of this. She was proud of that, though she recognized it as a small and somewhat foolish thing to be proud of. Edwin listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire. "James was a good man," he said at last. "I knew him from his first year in the valley. We ran a fence line together once in the winter of '74. He knew cattle and he knew land, and he did not cheat anyone." He paused. "He talked about you. Theodora was not prepared for that. Did he? He said you were the most determined woman he had ever met." A ghost of something crossed Edwin's face. He said it with considerable admiration. She looked at her hands. "I should have come with him when he first settled the land. I was stubborn about Pueblo. My mother was ill." "People have reasons," Edwin said simply. "That is not your fault." She looked up at him. "Mr. Garrett, I need to understand something. You have just offered your home to a woman you have never met, on the basis of a burned document, and a claim that she is connected to a man you knew 3 or 4 years ago. That is either extraordinary generosity or extraordinary imprudence, and I cannot tell which." The ghost of an expression crossed his face again, and she realized with some surprise that it was amusement. It was very contained amusement, barely there, but it was present. "Mrs. Turner," he said, "I know every inch of this valley. I know where James Turner's survey stakes are because I helped him set 2 of them in the fall of 1873. I know what Colby's land company does because they have tried to buy me out twice, and I have watched them take 3 other homesteads in this county through methods I would not call honest." He looked at her steadily. "And I know what a woman looks like when she is telling the truth. You are telling the truth." Theodora stared at him. Something tight and frightened in her chest shifted, very slightly, toward something that was not quite hope yet but was in hope's general direction. "Additionally," Edwin continued, "the stake certificates from the original survey of James's land are in my records. I kept copies because we shared the south boundary fence. If the bottom of your deed is burned, the certificates will show the missing boundary descriptions. You have the survey certificates," she said, and her voice did come apart a little then, just for a moment. "In a tin box in my study," he said, "where documents belong." She pressed her free hand to her mouth. Clara stirred against her chest and settled again. "Those certificates," she said carefully once she had her voice back, "would complete the legal record. Combined with your deed and a statement from me as a bordering landowner." "Yes," Edwin said. "I am not a lawyer, but I know enough to believe it would hold." "Warren Colby will not simply accept it," she said. "No," Edwin agreed, and that single syllable had a quiet weight to it that told her he was not afraid of that fact. "He will not, but that is a problem to approach methodically, not in the dark after 3 days on the trail. Tonight you sleep. Tomorrow we look at the certificates and decide what steps to take." Theodora looked at this man, his steady hands, his level eyes, the unhurried certainty with which he offered what he had. "Why?" she asked, because she could not help it. "You owe me nothing." "You owe James nothing. He has been gone 2 months. Edwin was quiet for a long moment. When he answered, his voice was unchanged, that same low, careful register. "Because the right thing is the right thing, Mrs. Turner, and I have spent 32 years in this world, and I know it when I see it. And because this land was James's, and now it is yours, and Colby has no legitimate claim to it, and I am not willing to watch that happen in my own valley when I have the means to prevent it." It was perhaps the longest speech she would come to learn he ever made unprompted. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett," she said. "Edwin," he said. "If you are going to stay in this valley, which you are, we might as well be less formal about it." "Theodora," she offered. He nodded once, and that was that. "Mrs. Acosta installed Theodora in the upstairs spare room, which had a real bed with a rope mattress and a quilt, and a cradle in the corner that appeared to have been brought up from storage and dusted off, though Theodora could not imagine when this had happened because there had not been enough time. When she asked, Mrs. Acosta simply said that she had set it up years ago when her own granddaughter had visited, and it had remained in storage ever since, and was it not fortunate that things were kept rather than discarded? Theodora laid Clara in the cradle and stood over her for a long moment in the lamplight. Her daughter's face was round and perfect and entirely unconcerned with the precariousness of their situation, which Theodora found both endearing and faintly enviable. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and finally let herself feel the full weight of the past 2 months. The grief for James, which was real and complicated and not simple, because they had been partners and companions and fond of each other even if they had not been the kind of love story that poets wrote about. The fear for Clara, the cold fury at Colby. And underneath all of it, somewhere strange and unexpected, the echo of Edwin Garrett's voice saying you are home now with complete and unquestioning conviction. She fell asleep before she could think about that last part too carefully. She slept for 11 hours. When she came downstairs in the morning, Edwin was already at the table with a spread of documents before him, the tin box he had mentioned open to one side. He looked up when she appeared on the stairs, Clara on her hip and both of them considerably more presentable after a night of rest and the use of the wash basin Mrs. Acosta had left in the room. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." She came to the table and looked at the documents. The survey certificates were there, neat and precise in the hand of the county surveyor, dated October 1873 and bearing the official seal of Pueblo County. She could see immediately that they described the northern boundary of James's claim in the exact language that had been burned from the deed. Her throat tightened. "Sit down," Edwin said. "Mrs. Acosta has made coffee. I want to show you what we have and what we need." He showed her, with the patience of a man who had thought this through carefully before she came downstairs, the precise legal picture. The survey certificates established the boundaries. Her burned deed, incomplete as it was, established original ownership. A sworn affidavit from Edwin as a neighboring landowner who had witnessed the original staking would corroborate both. The question was jurisdiction. Colby's fraudulent claim had been filed in Pueblo County, which meant they needed to appear before the county judge in Pueblo, a man named Hargrave, who Edwin described as honest but old-fashioned, meaning he would be moved by documentation and by the testimony of a man of standing in the community. "The problem," Edwin said, "is that Colby will know the moment I ride into Pueblo what I am there for, because he has men who watch the roads and report to him. He will use the intervening time to shore up his claim however he can. Can he fabricate additional documents? He can try. Whether they will hold under scrutiny is another matter." Edwin turned a survey certificate over in his hands, then set it down. "I want to send a letter ahead by a route Colby does not watch to a man named Daniel Forsyth in Pueblo. He is an attorney, a good one, and he has opposed Colby's land company before. He will know how to prepare." Theodora watched him. He had clearly spent the night thinking about her problem, organizing it, mapping a route through it. There was something in this that moved her in a way she could not quite name, because it was not rescue exactly. It was more like the specific and deliberate act of someone choosing to stand beside you and point in the right direction. "You did not have to do any of this overnight," she said. He glanced at her briefly and then back at the documents. "I was awake anyway," he said. There were men on the ranch, she discovered over the following days, 3 of them. Hector Reyes, who was Edwin's foreman and had been with him for 7 years. A younger hand named Pete Caldwell, who was perhaps 22 and possessed of a cheerful volubility that served as an interesting counterpoint to Edwin's economy of speech. And an older man called simply Grady, who was somewhere between 60 and 70, had been a cavalry scout in his youth, and now managed the horses and offered opinions on every subject whether or not they were solicited. They were all, without exception, kind to Theodora in the unaffected way of men who worked for a man whose example they followed. No one stared at Clara, no one asked intrusive questions, no one made Theodora feel that her presence was unusual or burdensome. Pete Caldwell made faces at Clara that reliably produced a gummy and delighted response, which elevated him considerably in Theodora's estimation. She had told Edwin on her second morning that she would not simply sit in the house and wait while he managed her affairs. She was aware this was not the response he had perhaps expected, but she was also aware, from the way he paused and then nodded, that it was not the response he found objectionable. "What can you do?" he asked, not dismissively but with genuine practical inquiry. "I can cook reasonably well, I can keep accounts, I can ride a horse, I can mend, and I know cattle from having grown up on a ranch in Kansas before my family moved to Pueblo," she said. "What I cannot do is pretend to be decorative and patient while decisions are being made about my life." He considered this. "The accounts," he said. "Mrs. Acosta cooks. But the ranch accounts have been in a state that I find unsatisfactory since I lost my previous bookkeeper to a mining claim in January. If you have a head for numbers, there is work there." "I have an excellent head for numbers," she said. He showed her the account books that afternoon, which were indeed in a somewhat tangled state, and left her with them at the big table and a lamp and a pot of coffee, and she had found 3 errors and reorganized the quarterly cattle tally before supper. When she showed him what she had done, he looked at it for a long time without speaking. "You are thorough," he said at last. "I told you I had an excellent head for numbers," she said. He looked up at her then, and there it was again, that contained and quiet amusement. "You did," he agreed. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that surprised Theodora by being, underneath the anxiety about Colby and the legal situation, genuinely good. She kept the accounts and learned the names of the cattle and took long, slow walks with Clara in the afternoon along the creek, because the weather in May was merciful, and the valley was so beautiful it sometimes made her stop walking and simply stand still and look at it. Mrs. Acosta, whose full name was Rosa Acosta, and whose history included a late husband, 3 grown children in Santa Fe, and 40 years of practical wisdom accumulated under difficult circumstances, became a warmth and a steadiness in Theodora's days. And then there was Edwin. Edwin Garrett was not a man who made things easy or obvious. He was not a man who talked about himself, or offered personal information, or said things he did not mean. He was competent and quiet and present, and the more Theodora was around him, the more she noticed the specific quality of his presence. The way a room had a different weight when he was in it, the way he listened when she spoke with an attention so complete and focused that she sometimes lost her train of thought entirely and had to begin a sentence again. He had his own grief, she came to understand. Not from anything he said directly, but from the small surrounding evidences. The cradle in the storage room, the extra chair at the table that was always set but never sat in, the woman's name carved into the bark of the old cottonwood by the creek, Margaret, with a date beneath it, 1872. She did not ask. When he was ready to tell her, or if he was ever ready, she would listen. Until then, it was his to keep. What she noticed was that around Clara, Edwin's carefully maintained reserve showed its edges. Not dramatically, not in the way of a man who made a performance of softening. But Clara had developed the habit, somewhere in her 5th or 6th day at the ranch, of watching Edwin with the same intent focus that Edwin himself employed, and when he was near her, she would reach toward him with those small, inexorable hands, and he would, with tremendous care and a kind of held-breath deliberateness, allow her to take hold of his finger. The first time he held Clara, it was because Theodora was needed urgently in the yard, where one of the horses had gotten into a tangle with the fence, and Mrs. Acosta was at the kitchen stove with both hands occupied, and the only option was to hand the baby to Edwin, who was standing nearest. She handed Clara over with a brief instruction about supporting the head and then went to deal with the horse. And when she came back 10 minutes later, Edwin was standing by the window with Clara held correctly and carefully against his chest. And Clara was looking up at him with the expression of someone who has found an arrangement entirely to her satisfaction. And Edwin was looking down at her with an expression that Theodora would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was the look of a man who has been lonely for a long time and has only just now been reminded of what the alternative feels like. She did not say anything. She simply came and collected her daughter and thanked him, and he handed Clara back with careful hands and said it had been no trouble, and they did not discuss it. But something had shifted, in a way that both of them felt and neither of them was ready to name. The letter to Daniel Forsyth had been sent by way of Grady, who rode a northern route through the mountains and avoided Colby's watchers on the southern road. Forsyth wrote back in late April with a careful and encouraging assessment of the case, agreed to take the matter on, and requested that Edwin and Theodora come to Pueblo in the first week of June to appear before Judge Hargrave, by which time Forsyth would have prepared the necessary filings. This gave them approximately 5 weeks. Edwin used those weeks to prepare his affidavit with the help of Forsyth's letters, gathering additional witnesses where he could. Grady, it turned out, had ridden through this part of the valley when James Turner was originally staking his claim, and had a clear memory of the survey process. Pete Caldwell knew nothing about the original claim, but was enthusiastic about helping in any capacity, and was kept on standby for purposes of optimism. It was during these weeks that the thing between Theodora and Edwin began to develop in the careful, tentative, honest way of two people who have both been hurt before and are not entirely sure what they are doing. It started with the evenings. After supper, when Clara was settled and Mrs. Acosta had gone to her cottage behind the house, Edwin and Theodora found themselves at the table or by the fire with coffee, and Edwin, who had been trained by a parent long habit to disappear into his study in the evenings, began instead to remain. They talked about the land and the cattle and the county, and then, as the weeks accumulated, about other things. Books, because Edwin had those 40 volumes on his shelf and read them seriously, and Theodora had always been a reader and had not had access to books in a long time and fell on the shelf with visible gratitude. Kansas, because that was where she was from, and he was curious about the plains after a life in the mountains. Music, because she mentioned once that she had played the piano as a girl, and he said that there had been a piano in this house once, and then went quiet in a way that confirmed what she already suspected about who had played it. Margaret, she said one evening in the 3rd week of May very gently. He was still for a moment looking at the fire. Then he said, "My wife, she died in the spring of 1872. There was a child, a boy, born too early. He lived 3 days, a pause. After that it was just me and the land and the work." Theodora did not offer the inadequate consolations that people offered. She knew what they felt like on the receiving end. "I am sorry," she said, "truly." "It has been 6 years," he said. "It is not the same pain it was." "No," she agreed. "It changes. It does not end, but it changes." He looked at her then across the fire. "James," he asked. "We were good to each other," she said honestly. "We were not a love story, I do not think, the way some people are. We were partners and we were kind, and I grieve him as I would grieve anyone who was good to me and who should not be gone." She was quiet for a moment. "What I am most angry about is that he was robbed. His life was taken from him by a greedy man with a lantern and a grudge, and I want that made right more than I have wanted almost anything." "We will make it right," Edwin said quietly. "You seem very certain of that." "I am," she looked at him. "You are the most certain person I have ever met," she said, "about everything. You decide a thing and it simply becomes so." Something moved across his face. "Not everything," he said. "There are things I am not certain of." She waited, but he did not elaborate and she did not push. 2 days later, he asked if she would like to ride out to the north pasture with him, where he needed to check on the fence situation that had been developing along the creek bank where spring flooding had undermined 2 posts. Mrs. Acosta would keep Clara for the afternoon. Theodora said yes, and they rode out together on a May afternoon that was perfect in every ordinary and unrepeatable way. The sky a deep and serious blue, the air still cool with the altitude, the grass beginning to green properly across the whole length of the valley. Edwin led her to the damaged fence, made his assessment, then sat on his horse for a moment looking north toward the line of his property where it met the foothills. Theodora came up beside him. "That ridge," she said, "is that the northern boundary of your land?" "Yes, and if you follow it east about a quarter mile, that is where it meets the northwestern corner of what was James's claim." He paused. "What is your claim?" "My claim," she said. She liked the way that sounded, solid, real, hers. "When this is settled," Edwin said, still looking north, "and it will be settled, you will need help to work it. The land has been sitting since James left to bring you west last fall. It will need fencing and grazing assessment before you could put cattle on it." "I know," she said. "One thing at a time." He glanced at her sideways. "You are not afraid of any of this, are you?" She considered the question honestly. "I am afraid of several things," she said. "I am afraid of something happening to Clara. I am afraid of Colby winning. I am afraid of being alone on 240 acres with a baby and no one who knows what they are doing." She paused. "But afraid does not mean unable. I have always found them to be separate conditions." He turned to look at her fully then with those clear gray eyes, and the look was different from the looks before, less studied, more open, as if something had given way behind it. "You are remarkable," he said, and it was not a compliment offered in the easy currency of social exchange. It was a simple statement of observed fact, and it landed on her accordingly with a weight and a warmth that went somewhere deep. "Edwin," she said. "I know," he said, and looked away again back at the ridge. "I know. It is complicated, and it is too soon, and you have too much in front of you to also be dealing with what I am thinking." She was silent for a moment. The creek ran below them, silver and unhurried. A hawk turned overhead on a long, lazy spiral. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then, "That I have lived 6 years in this valley alone, and it did not seem like a choice I had made. It seemed like the way things were. And then you rode down that trail 3 weeks ago with that burned deed, and that baby, and you looked at me like you were measuring whether I was worth talking to, and I have not been able to think clearly about anything since." She felt the words go through her like a change in the weather, sudden and complete. She looked at his profile, the straight line of his jaw, the way he held himself in the saddle with that contained and careful dignity. "I have Clara," she said. "She would be part of whatever this was." "I know," he said. "And I have a land claim that is not yet resolved and a man in Pueblo who would very much like to bury both of us, legally speaking." "I know that too. And I have been a widow for 2 months. He turned to look at her again. "I am not asking you for anything, Theodora. I am not asking you to decide anything or to promise anything. I am only being honest about what is true, because I have found that not being honest about what is true generally makes everything worse." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "I think you should know that I have been watching you with my daughter, and the way you hold her tells me more about you than everything else you have shown me, which has already been considerable." A long pause. The hawk made another slow pass overhead. "What does it tell you?" he asked. "That you are gentle," she said. "Underneath all that certainty and quiet, that you know how to be careful with something small and important." She looked back at the ridge. "That is not nothing, Edwin Garrett. That is actually quite a great deal." They rode back to the ranch without saying anything more about it, but the silence on the way back was entirely different from any silence that had existed between them before, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was afraid of it. The first week of June came, and with it, the trip to Pueblo. Edwin arranged for Mrs. Acosta to travel with them as far as the first town, where her cousin lived, and Clara would stay there with Mrs. Acosta and the cousin during the court proceedings. which Edwin judged would last no more than 2 days. Grady and Hector rode with them, not as an aggressive show of force, but because the road to Pueblo in 1878 was not a road where a reasonable person traveled alone if they could avoid it, and because Edwin was not a man who left things to chance. They arrived in Pueblo on a Tuesday evening in the second week of June. The town was as Theodora remembered it, busy and loud and smelling of horses and coal smoke, and the peculiar ambition of a place that was still deciding what it was going to be. She had spent 3 years here, and none of the feelings coming back to her as they rode down the main street were particularly warm. Daniel Forsythe was a compact man of about 45 with sharp eyes behind steel-rimmed spectacles and a manner that combined legal precision with a genuine contempt for dishonesty that Theodora found immediately reassuring. He met them at his office on Pine Street and spent 2 hours reviewing everything they had brought. "The survey certificates are excellent," he said, setting them down with satisfaction. "Combined with the deed and Mr. Garrett's affidavit, the chain of ownership is clear. Colby's claim relies entirely on the debt settlement agreement, which I have been examining." He removed his spectacles and polished them with a cloth. "The signature on that document does not match James Turner's signature on any other document I have been able to locate. The formation of the letters is different in 3 specific places." "You can demonstrate that to Hargrave?" Edwin asked. "I can demonstrate it to anyone with eyes," Forsythe said. "The harder question is whether Colby comes to court or sends someone to discourage us from attending." "He will not send anyone," Edwin said, in that tone of quiet certainty. "He knows I am here, and he knows who I am in this county. He will fight this in court because that is where he believes he has the advantage." Forsythe looked at Edwin with what appeared to be respect. "I believe you are right. The hearing is Thursday morning at 9. I recommend you both get a good night's sleep." They stayed at the hotel on 2nd Street. Theodora lay in her room and listened to the sounds of Pueblo at night, which were louder and more chaotic than the sounds of the valley, and thought about Thursday, and about what happened after Thursday, and about Edwin Garrett in that order. After Thursday, if they won, she would have her land. 240 acres in the valley, adjacent to Edwin's ranch. She would need to rebuild the farmhouse, which had not yet been started because the property had been in legal dispute, and she would need to establish her cattle, and she would need to do all of this while raising a baby and keeping accounts that were currently serving 2 ranches rather than 1. It was a great deal. She was not afraid of it, but in the dark and quiet of the hotel room, she was honest with herself in a way that daylight made easier to avoid. She did not want to do it alone. Not because she could not. She could. She was sure of that in the way she was sure of very little else right now. But there was a difference between capable and right, and the thought of the valley, of the creek and the cottonwoods and the green fields, with Edwin in it and Clara in it and herself in it, had begun to feel not like a complicated arrangement of overlapping claims and legal necessities, but like something else entirely. Like home, which was precisely the word he had used the first day, and which she had not understood then, but which she understood now. She went asleep before she could think any further into it. Thursday morning arrived with a clear sky and a courthouse that smelled of linseed oil and old paper. Warren Colby was already there when they arrived, a broad man of about 50 with a florid face and the particular confidence of someone who has won arguments through money, rather than merit for so long that he has forgotten other methods exist. He had 2 lawyers with him, and a land agent whom Theodora recognized as the man who had appeared at her door 3 days after James's funeral with the fraudulent settlement papers. She felt the fury again, clean and cold, and let it settle into her spine where it was useful. The hearing was before Judge Hargrave, who was indeed old-fashioned, with white whiskers and a careful, deliberate manner that reminded Theodora of a man who measured twice before cutting once. He reviewed all the documents that Forsythe submitted with an attention so thorough that the room was nearly silent for 20 minutes while he read. Forsythe presented the case with the clean, logical structure of a man who was very good at what he did. He walked through the original deed, through the survey certificates, through Edwin's affidavit. He presented 3 letters in James Turner's confirmed handwriting from other correspondents and laid them beside the alleged debt settlement signature. And he explained, in precise and damning detail, the specific ways in which the signature on the settlement agreement differed from James Turner's actual handwriting. Colby's lawyers tried. They argued that the burned deed was insufficient, that the survey certificates were Edwin Garrett's documents and could have been altered, that the handwriting comparison was speculative. Hargrave listened to all of it with the same patient thoroughness he had given to Forsyth, and then he asked questions, sharp and specific questions, and Colby's men began to have less certain answers. Edwin was called to give testimony. He stood at the front of the courtroom in his good dark jacket and answered every question Forsyth, and then Colby's lawyers put to him with the same calm and level certainty that he brought to everything else. He described the original staking of James's claim. He described the fence line they shared. He described his familiarity with James Turner's character and with Warren Colby's methods. When one of Colby's lawyers attempted to suggest that Edwin had a personal financial interest in the outcome, Edwin looked at him with those gray eyes and said that his only interest was in the truth being correctly established, and something in the way he said it made the lawyer's next question die before he could ask it. Theodora testified as well. She had rehearsed nothing, because she found rehearsed testimony made her feel dishonest even when the substance was true. She told the story as she had told it to Edwin that first evening, plainly and precisely and without embellishment, and when Colby's lawyer pressed her on why she could not produce the lower third of the deed, she said that it was because her house had been set on fire at 2 in the morning, and she had been occupied with getting her infant daughter out alive, and she said it in a tone so flat and factual that several people in the gallery shifted in their seats. Hargrave recessed for an hour. When he returned, he ruled entirely in Theodora's favor. He declared Colby's debt settlement agreement fraudulent on the evidence of the handwriting analysis and the absence of any supporting financial records from James Turner's estate. He affirmed the original deed, completed by the survey certificates and the corroborating affidavit, as the valid title to the 240 acres. He levied a substantial fine against Colby's land company and referred the matter of the forged document to the county sheriff for further investigation. Colby left the courtroom without speaking, which Theodora supposed was some kind of victory in itself. The land agent who had appeared at her door 3 days after James's funeral caught her eye as he passed and looked quickly away, and she watched him go with a feeling that was not quite satisfaction but was something in that neighborhood. Forsyth shook her hand and then Edwin's. "It was a good case," he said. "The certificates were the foundation of it. Without those, it would have been much harder." "Keep them in a tin box," Edwin said, which was the driest joke Theodora had ever heard from him, and which made Forsyth laugh out loud and made Theodora, despite herself, do the same. They stood outside the courthouse in the June sunlight, the street busy with horses and wagons and the ordinary noise of a town going about its day. Theodora held her copy of the affirmed deed, properly completed now with Forsyth's annotation of the survey certificate numbers, and looked at it for a moment. "It is whole," she said. "The deed is whole." "It is," Edwin said. She looked up at him. He was standing close, not inappropriately so, but close in the way that had become natural over the weeks of proximity, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cool mountain air. "Edwin," she said. "Theodora," he said. They stood there for a moment in the sunlight with the street noise around them, both of them aware of the specific weight of what was on the other side of the practicalities. "I need to go back and get my daughter," she said. "Yes," he said. "And then we need to go back to the valley." "Yes," he said again. "And then," she said, "I think there are some things we need to talk about." He looked at her with those gray eyes, and in the full light of the June sun she could see everything in them clearly. The steadiness, the intelligence, the grief he had lived through and survived, the the 6 years of careful solitude, and underneath all of it, something that had been waiting with the patient certainty of a man who knows that some things cannot be rushed and some things cannot be stopped. "I think so too," he said quietly. They collected Clara from Mrs. Acosta's cousin, and Theodora held her daughter in the yard outside the little house, and felt the specific and enormous relief of having her back, solid and warm and smelling of baby and Mrs. Acosta's lavender soap. Clara grabbed her braid and looked around with bright, interested eyes, and when she saw Edwin standing nearby, she reached toward him with both arms in the imperious way she had developed, and Edwin stepped forward without hesitation and took her, and held her against his shoulder, and she patted his cheek twice with a flat, small hand, and then looked around at the world from this superior height with enormous satisfaction. Theodora watched them and felt something in her chest settle into place with the quiet certainty of a key turning in a lock it was made for. The ride back to the valley took them 2 days. On the evening of the first day, they camped near a stream in the foothills, Hector and Grady a respectful distance away with the horses, Mrs. Acosta asleep in the wagon with Clara, and Edwin and Theodora sitting by the small camp fire with the western sky still holding the last thin line of orange above the dark mountains. "Tell me something about yourself," Theodora said. "Something that has nothing to do with land or cattle or Colby." He thought about it. "I played chess with my father every Sunday until he died," he said. "I have not played it since because I do not have anyone here who plays." "I play," she said. He looked at her. "My father taught me when I was 7, she said. "He said it was as important for a girl to know strategy as it was for a boy, and that anyone who told me differently was someone who benefited from my ignorance." "Your father sounds like a sensible man," Edwin said. "He was." She looked at the fire. "He died in 1870. My mother followed him in 73. By then I was married and in Pueblo." She paused. "I miss them, even now." "That does not go away either," Edwin said. "Missing people. No. But you learn to carry it differently." She looked up at the sky, which had gone full dark and was extravagant with stars at this elevation. "Edwin, can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," he said, which was not quite the same as promising to answer but was as close as he got. "When you said I was home that first day," she said, "what did you mean by it exactly?" He was quiet for a while, watching the fire. The cottonwoods along the stream rustled in the night wind. "I meant the valley," he said first, carefully. "The land was James's and is yours, and the valley is where it is. That part is straightforward." A pause. "But I also meant—" He stopped, started again. "I have been standing in that yard watching people ride by for 6 years, and something in the way you came down that trail. You were not asking permission to be there. You were arriving. Like you already knew you were supposed to be there and were only verifying the fact." She looked at him. The firelight caught the angles of his face and the steadiness of his hands resting on his knees. "And you felt that," she said. "I felt that," he confirmed. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I have been trying to be sensible about this, telling myself it has been too few weeks and too much turmoil and that I should not mistake gratitude for something else." "And have you," he asked, "mistaken it?" She met his eyes, and in the firelight, with the stars overhead and the stream sound and the smell of pine and cold night air, she made the decision that she had been circling for weeks. Not the dramatic decision of a woman overcome by circumstance, but the quiet, clear-eyed decision of a woman who had learned, at some considerable cost, that life did not offer unlimited chances at something real. "No," she said, "I have not mistaken it. Whatever this is, it is not just gratitude." He reached across the small distance between them and took her hand. He did it simply and without drama, the same way he did everything, and held it with a careful warmth that she felt all the way through. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "When we are back in the valley and things have settled and you have had time to breathe, I would like to do it the right way." She looked at his hand over hers. His fingers were long and work roughened and utterly steady. "All right," she said. "I would like that." He did not kiss her that night. He simply held her hand by the firelight for a while, and then the fire burned lower and they said good night and went to their respective sides of the camp, and that was somehow exactly enough. The valley was waiting for them when they rode down from the pass on the second afternoon, green and wide and washed in the amber light of a late afternoon sun. Theodora felt it again as she came down the trail, the sensation she had felt the first time, the one that said something had been promised here. But it was different now, fuller, because this time she knew whose horses were in the corrals and whose coffee was probably still warm on the stove and whose gray eyes would find her when she came into the yard. Home, she thought. Yes, that was the right word. The summer that followed was the happiest Theodora had known since before things began going wrong, which was a span of years she did not count exactly because the counting made the happiness feel fragile. But the happiness was not fragile. It had a foundation. Edwin courted her with the same deliberate, unhurried intention that he brought to everything else. He was not a man for grand gestures, but he was absolutely a man for consistency. And consistency, Theodora had come to believe, was the most romantic quality she could imagine, because it was the only one that did not diminish with time. He brought her books from the shelf with careful notes tucked inside about which passages he wanted her to read. He had Hector bring a chessboard down from the attic and they played in the evenings after supper, and he was a serious and excellent chess player who did not condescend when she took his bishop in the third game, though he was quiet about it for a few minutes. He rode with her to the northeast corner of her land, the first time she put her feet on it properly as its legal owner, and stood behind her while she looked across the 240 acres that the afternoon sun was painting gold, and he said nothing because nothing needed to be said, and his presence was the right kind of company for a moment that deserved to be large. He helped her plan the farmhouse that would need to be built there. They spread a rough map on the table one September evening and debated the placement of it, because Theodora wanted it to face the creek, and Edwin thought the south-facing aspect would be more practical for winter light. And they argued about it in the agreeable way of two people who are comfortable enough with each other to disagree without it meaning anything alarming, and eventually settled on a compromise position that incorporated both priorities and was probably better than either original idea. He asked about her parents, about her childhood in Kansas, about books she had loved before the years in Pueblo when there had been no books. He listened to her with that focused attention that she had come to understand was simply the way he was built, that he was not performing interest. He was genuinely interested, and that everything about Theodora Turner, from her opinions on chess openings to her memories of Kansas thunderstorms, was something he wanted to know. Clara grew and changed the way babies do in the first year, rapidly, and with a thoroughness that sometimes made Theodora feel she was watching fast water. She rolled and then sat, and then pulled herself to standing with the determination of someone who had already decided she was not going to wait for anyone's assistance. She had James's dark eyes and Theodora's stubborn chin, and she had, early and firmly, decided that Edwin Garrett was one of her preferred people, which she demonstrated by crying emphatically when he left a room, and by greeting his return with a volume and enthusiasm entirely disproportionate to the duration of his absence. Edwin took this in stride with the same quiet care he brought to everything. He held Clara during the evening hours with a naturalness that had developed over the summer from careful and deliberate into simple and easy. He talked to her seriously, narrating his thoughts on the cattle and the weather and the state of the north fence the way some men talk to horses, which Theodora found privately and enormously endearing. Clara's first real word, spoken on an October morning when Edwin came in from the corral, was a sound that could reasonably be interpreted as his name, and the look on Edwin Garrett's face in that moment was something Theodora would put in a private room in her memory and revisit whenever the world seemed difficult. In October, on a Friday evening when the aspen trees along the creek had gone entirely golden and the air smelled of the first real winter coming, Edwin asked Theodora to walk with him to the cottonwood by the creek. They stood there in the late afternoon light, the bark of the tree carved with that name, Margaret, and the date. Theodora had stood here before on her afternoon walks, but not with him. "I wanted you to be here with me when I said this," he said, "because I think it matters that she is part of the story too, and I do not want you to ever feel that what I feel for you is somehow opposed to what I felt for her." He looked at the carving, then at Theodora. "They are different. They belong to different parts of my life, and they are both real." Theodora felt her eyes fill and was not going to apologize for it. "That is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me," she told him. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, simple and plain, a band of gold with a small dark stone, garnet perhaps, set in a delicate star of silver. He held it in his palm and looked at her. "I am not going to make a speech," he said. "I think you know everything I would say. I think you probably know me better by now than I know myself in some respects." A pause. "Will you marry me, Theodora?" She looked at the ring in his steady palm. She looked at his face, weathered and honest and steady, with those clear gray eyes that had been seeing her, truly seeing her since the very first day. She thought of Clara and the valley and the chess games and the fire-lit evenings and all the ordinary days that had been so quietly extraordinary, and she said, "Yes, Edwin Garrett, I will absolutely marry you." He put the ring on her finger. Then, with the creek sound behind them and the golden light through the aspens and the carved name of his first love on the bark above them as a kind of blessing rather than a shadow, he kissed her for the first time, and it was unhurried and careful and entirely real, the way he was, and when they drew back she was smiling and so was he, and she decided that his smile, which she had seen in full only a handful of times but which transformed his whole face, was something she intended to spend the rest of her life earning as often as possible. They were married in December, when the valley was deep in snow and the mountains were white above the tree line, and the ranch house smelled of pine boughs and Mrs. Acosta's extraordinary cooking. The ceremony was held in the main room of the ranch house, performed by the circuit preacher who came through every 8 weeks, and who was a genial man named Reverend Alden, who had a gift for the essential, and did not fill a room unnecessarily with words. Hector stood as witness for Edwin, Grady standing beside him, with an expression of such satisfied approval that he resembled nothing so much as a man who had bet on a horse and watched it win handsomely. Pete Caldwell cried, which he denied afterward but which 3 people had witnessed. Mrs. Acosta held Clara throughout the ceremony, but Clara, when the moment came that Reverend Alden announced them husband and wife, produced a sound of such loud and particular approval that everyone laughed, including Edwin, and the laughter was the best possible sound for a wedding to end on. The winter was long and cold and entirely good. Theodora discovered that being married to Edwin Garrett was, in almost all the ways that mattered, exactly what she had anticipated, and in some ways that she had not. He was still quiet, still certain, still the man who measured twice and cut once and did everything with the specific unhurried intention that was simply the structure of him. But in the private hours of a shared life, the quietness had a different quality, warmer and more open. He talked more, not more than was his nature, but more than he had in the months before, and he listened in that way of his that made her feel that every word she said was worth the hearing. He read aloud to her in the evening sometimes, when the wind came hard off the mountains and the fire was high and Clara was asleep. He had a good reading voice, low and careful, and the 40 books on the shelf became intimate territory for both of them. He finished teaching her the things about chess she had not known, and she occasionally beat him now, which he received with a dignified equanimity that she suspected cost him slightly more than he showed, and which she found wonderful. By January she knew she was expecting a child. She told Edwin on a Thursday morning, while he was putting on his coat to go to the barn, very simply, because she had found that simple was usually right with him. He turned from the coat hook and looked at her, and that look was back, the one she had first seen when he was holding Clara by the window, the one that was the full weight of a man who understands what he has been given. He crossed the room and put his hands on her face carefully and kissed her forehead. Then he said against her hair, "Are you well? How long have you known? Do you need anything?" "I am well," she said. 2 weeks. "And right now I need you to be as happy as you look." "I am," he said. "I am extremely happy." "Good," she said. "Then go check on the cattle and stop looking at me like that or I will cry, and it is too cold to cry." He laughed and kissed her again and went to the barn, and she stood in the kitchen with her hand flat on the front of her dress and felt the particular happiness that comes from a life that has been hard and is now, right now, in this moment, more than you thought you would be allowed to have. Spring came back to the valley in 1879 with the same generous early warmth it had shown the previous year, and with the spring came the beginning of the work on the farmhouse on Theodora's land. Edwin had arranged a work crew with a builder from town, and they rode out to the northeast property every week to check on the progress, sometimes with Clara between them on the saddle, pointing at the construction with the imperious curiosity of a 1-year-old who has opinions about everything. The farmhouse took shape through the spring and into early summer, solid and well-built, facing the creek the way Theodora had wanted, with south-facing windows the way Edwin had argued for, and a deep porch that was entirely the result of their compromise discussion and was better than either had originally proposed. It would be a rental property for now, because Theodora and Edwin were not about to separate their household, and because the extra income would be useful, and because a good house was better kept inhabited than empty, a point on which they agreed without needing to debate it. On a June morning exactly 1 year after the courthouse in Pueblo, Theodora went into labor. Mrs. Acosta and the midwife from town were both present, and Edwin paced the downstairs hall in a manner that Pete Caldwell later described as the most human he had ever seen Mr. Garrett, which Hector said was not a high bar, but was nonetheless something to see. Grady sat on the porch and whittled and said nothing, because Grady understood that some situations required only presence and not commentary. The baby was born at midday, a boy, solid and loud from the first breath, with Edwin's dark hair and Theodora's green eyes and an expression of considerable indignation about his recent relocation to the outside world. Edwin was brought upstairs and stood at the bedside and looked at his son for a long moment, and then at Theodora, who was tired and flushed and entirely splendid, and the look he gave her was beyond what she had words for. "He is perfect," Edwin said. "He is very loud," she said, because the boy was still expressing his opinions at volume. "He is loudly perfect," Edwin amended, which made her laugh, which made her wince, which made him sit carefully on the edge of the bed and take her free hand. "What should we name him?" she asked. "James," Edwin said. She looked at him. "Are you certain?" "James was a good man," Edwin said, "and it is a good name." He held her gaze. "Unless you would prefer not to, I want you to choose." "James," she said. "James Edwin Garrett. Yes, that is right." Edwin looked at his son, who had quieted somewhat and was now regarding the world with enormous and skeptical dark eyes. "James Edwin Garrett," he said softly. "You have a great deal of valley to explore." Clara was introduced to her brother that afternoon, and her reaction was a mixture of fascination and the careful assessment of someone who has been the sole center of attention and is adjusting her understanding of the new arrangement. She touched James's hand with one careful finger and then looked up at Edwin with an expression that said she was reserving judgment. Edwin, to his credit, told her very seriously that James would look up to her when he was older, because she was first and that mattered, and Clara appeared to find this satisfactory. The summer of 1879 was full and good. The ranch ran well under Edwin and Hector's management. The cattle were healthy. The accounts that Theodora kept were balanced and clearly organized. And the valley in the long evenings of midsummer was a thing of such beauty that Theodora sometimes sat on the porch with James on her lap and Clara at her feet, and simply looked at the mountains going pink in the late light, and could not imagine being anywhere else on earth. Warren Colby, it became known that fall, had been indicted by the county sheriff on charges related to the forged document and to 2 other fraudulent land transfers that Forsyth's subsequent investigation had uncovered. He spent the better part of 1880 in legal proceedings that ultimately resulted in significant fines, the dissolution of his land company, and a permanent move out of Pueblo County. Theodora received this news one afternoon in September when Edwin came in from town with a letter from Forsyth, and she read it at the table and then set it down and was quiet for a moment. "Is it over?" Edwin asked. "It is over," she said. He sat down across from her. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like something I have been carrying can finally be set down," she said. "Like James can rest." She looked at her hands. "Like I can stop being angry now if I choose to." "And do you choose to?" "Yes," she said. "I think I do." He reached across the table and took her hand as he had that first night by the campfire, and she turned her palm up and held his hand back. And they sat like that for a while in the afternoon quiet of the house, with the sound of Clara playing in the yard coming through the open window and James sleeping upstairs, and the valley green and permanent outside, and everything at last fully and properly resolved. The years moved through the valley the way seasons do, not quickly, but with the inevitability of something that knows what it is doing. The farmhouse on Theodora's land was tenanted by a young couple named the Murphys, who were good neighbors and kept the place well and became, over time, genuine friends. The accounts Theodora kept grew more complex as the ranch itself grew, and she expanded her role from keeper of records to active partner in the ranch's business decisions, which Edwin regarded as entirely natural, and the 3 men on the payroll regarded as the best development in the ranch's recent history, because Theodora Turner Garrett's instincts about when to sell and when to hold cattle were, by consistent evidence, excellent. Clara grew from a determined, an opinionated infant to a determined, an opinionated small girl who had the run of the valley, it seemed, and who spent her days in a state of vigorous inquiry about everything from why the creek ran faster in spring to whether horses understood human speech, to what exactly Grady's scar on his left hand was from. Questions that she directed at whatever adult was nearest with an energy that the adults in question handled with varying degrees of success. Edwin answered her with the same serious attention he gave to everything, which Clara responded to with absolute devotion. She was his shadow on the mornings he did not need her underfoot, trailing behind him to the corral, and the barn with the absorbed attention of an apprentice who has found the right teacher. James was 2 and then 3 and then 4, and he was a different kind of child from his sister. Quieter, more watchful, more inclined to sit in one place for long periods of time studying a thing from multiple angles before forming a conclusion about it, which was a characteristic so familiar that Theodora sometimes caught herself smiling when she saw it in him. He had Edwin's way of reaching a decision, and then simply acting on it without much additional discussion, which made him an interesting chess opponent when he was old enough for the game and a generally satisfying person to have in a room. In the spring of 1882, Theodora told Edwin she was expecting again. He received this news with the same careful joy as the first time, with the addition that he was now also a man with some experience of new babies, which made the anticipation less anxious and more simply glad. This baby was a girl, born in October into a household that had by now developed, through 4 years of daily life together, the specific warmth of a family that has earned itself. They named her Rosa, for Mrs. Acosta, who had been with them from the beginning and whose reaction to this honor was to cry without apology for 5 full minutes, and then to resume her characteristic practical efficiency, having apparently decided that the appropriate response to being honored was to make something excellent for dinner. The world outside the valley continued to be the world, complicated and sometimes unjust, moving through the particular upheavals of a country that was still deciding what it was and who it belonged to. The territory of Colorado had become a state in 1876, and the changes that came with statehood brought new laws and new arguments about land and water rights that Edwin navigated with his usual methodical care. The railroads came closer every year, changing the economics of cattle ranching in ways that required adjustment and attention, and Theodora's head for numbers proved, in this period, more valuable than ever. They talked about these things the way they talked about everything. At the table, by the fire, in the particular honest idiom that they had developed together, which had no room in it for performance or pretense. Edwin was still quiet and Theodora was still direct, and the combination continued to work as well as it ever had, possibly better, because people who are good for each other tend to become more themselves over time rather than less. On an evening in the summer of 1883, with all three children in bed and the valley going dark under a great pour of stars, they sat together on the porch in the way they had taken to doing most summer evenings, Edwin's arm around her shoulders and her head against him, and the mountains dark against the darker sky. "Do you remember what I thought when I first rode into this valley?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "I thought, here is a place where something was promised." She looked at the mountains. "I did not know what, I did not know to whom. I thought it might have been promised to James, and that what I was doing was simply trying to collect it on his behalf." "And now?" Edwin asked. She was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of his arm across her shoulders, hearing the creak in the dark below the porch, thinking of Clara and James and baby Rosa asleep upstairs, thinking of the account books and the chess board and the cottonwood with the carved name and the burned deed that was now whole and safe in its own tin box in Edwin's study. "Now I think it was promised to me," she said. "And I think you were part of the promise. I just did not know it yet when I arrived." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was thinking something through to its finish. Then he said, "I knew it." She looked up at him. "Did you? When you came down that trail," he said, "with the burned deed and the baby and that expression, I knew." "You are insufferably certain sometimes," she said. "Yes," he agreed, entirely without apology. She laughed, and he tightened his arm around her, and they sat together on the porch of the house that had been his and was now entirely theirs, in the valley that had been promised, while the stars performed their slow, enormous turning overhead, and the creek kept its faithful sound in the dark, and everything that had been broken was mended, and everything that had been lost had found its way home. The burned deed hung on the wall of the study. Edwin had framed it, the existing portion with its clear ink and its proper survey certificate numbers added in Forsyth's careful hand, and the burned edge, the place where it had nearly been lost, preserved honestly as part of the document rather than trimmed away. Theodora had looked at it the first time he hung it and asked him why he kept the burned part. "Because the burned part is what you survived," he said. "It should be part of the record." She had looked at it for a long time. Then she had nodded. "Yes," she said, "you are right, it should be." The document hung there in its frame through all the years that followed, through the growing of the children and the changing of the ranch and the shifting of the world outside the valley. It was the first thing their children asked about when they were old enough to notice it, and Theodora told them the story each time, starting from the beginning, the fire and the deed and the ride through the mountains and the man at the fence who had looked at her and said, "You are home now." Clara, who had heard the story more times than anyone, said once when she was about 9 that it was the best story she knew. She said this while sitting on the floor of the study looking up at the deed. "Why?" Edwin asked her from his chair. Clara thought about it with the thoroughness she applied to questions she took seriously. "Because Mama was brave and you were good and it worked out," she said. "Those three things do not always happen at the same time." Edwin looked at Theodora over Clara's head. Theodora looked back at him. Between them, without a word, passed the entirety of what they were to each other. The gratitude and the love and the grief they had each carried and set down, and the years of dailiness that had built something more solid than either of them would have thought possible on the day. A woman rode into a valley with a burned deed and a baby and was told, by a man who knew things without being able to always explain how he knew them, that she was home. "Your daughter," Edwin said, "is very wise." "She gets it from her father," Theodora said. Edwin raised an eyebrow. Theodora smiled. Clara, who had absorbed their exchange with her usual complete attention, said, "She means you, Papa," as if this required clarification. "I know who she means," Edwin said, and the contentment in his voice was the quiet kind, the deep kind, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it is simply the condition of the room. Outside, the valley went about its afternoon. The creek ran clear and quick over the stones it had been running over for longer than any of them had been alive. The horses moved in the south pasture with their slow, elegant certainty. The mountains stood where they had always stood, patient and enormous and entirely unchanged by anything that had happened in their shadow, which was both humbling and, if you let yourself feel it properly, a comfort. James Edwin Garrett, who at 5 years old had already developed the habit of sitting on the porch railing in the late afternoon and looking at the mountains with an expression of serious private thought, was doing exactly that when his mother came out and stood beside him. He did not look up immediately, being in the middle of whatever he was considering. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He considered the question. "Whether the mountain was here before the valley," he said. "Yes," she said. "How long?" "A very long time," she said. "Before any of us, before the ranch, before Colorado was Colorado." He thought about this. "And will it be here after?" "Yes," she said. He seemed to find this satisfactory. "Good," he said then. "Mama, when I am big, can I have the valley?" "Part of it," she said. "The north part is yours by right and the rest will go to your sisters, but the whole valley will always be your home." "That is different from having it." He turned this over. "Is having home enough?" She thought of riding down a mountain pass on a tired horse with a burned deed and a baby and 40 cents, and the knowledge that she had nowhere else to go. She thought of a man at a fence looking up at her with gray eyes and saying 4 words that had changed everything. "Yes," she told her son, "it is more than enough. It is everything." Inside the house, Edwin's voice rose briefly, asking something of Mrs. Acosta, and her answer came back in the warm, practical tones of a woman who had made herself indispensable to this household and knew it. Baby Rosa made a sound from somewhere upstairs that was either waking up or the preliminary stages of sleep, uncertain which way it intended to fall. Clara had come out onto the porch without anyone noticing and was now sitting on the step with a book from the shelf, her dark hair falling over her shoulder, entirely absorbed. It was an ordinary afternoon in the valley in 1883, in the great span of a country still becoming what it would be, with all the injustice and the hard beauty that implied. But inside the fence of this particular life, on this particular porch, in this valley that the mountains kept and the creek ran through without stopping, it was something so specifically and unrepeatable good that Theodora Turner Garrett stood with her son and felt it like sunlight, which was the right comparison. Not dramatic, not conditional, not requiring anything of you except that you be present and look at it. She was present. She looked at it. The valley was green and wide, and the creek caught the afternoon light and gave it back to the sky, and somewhere in the house behind her, Edwin Garrett was going about his evening with the quiet purpose that was simply the way he was made, and in a little while they would all sit down to supper, and after that there would be a fire and probably chess and certainly conversation, and all of it would be exactly what it was, real and earned and hers. Home, she thought. He had been right from the very first day, as he was right about most things in that still and certain way of his. She was home.